When a prison riots, it is never only a prison story. It is a story about pressure, authority, and the point where a system stops containing violence and starts producing it. In the late Soviet years, a few prison uprisings briefly came into public view, and what they revealed was deeply unsettling. Behind locked walls, the Soviet state was facing a crisis it could no longer fully hide. Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker realities behind the image of Soviet order. Soviet prisons were built to isolate, discipline, and control. But by the late 1980s, parts of that system were under severe strain. A 1991 Human Rights Watch report on prison conditions in the USSR described pretrial detention centers as decrepit, overcrowded, and airless, with detainees often spending months in cramped cells with almost no activity, poor food, inadequate medical care, and punishment cells that were dark, damp, and cold. The same report noted that uprisings against detention center authorities were becoming more common and that serious injuries and deaths had resulted. That is the key background for this story. Late Soviet prison unrest did not come out of nowhere. It came from a system already showing visible signs of breakdown. The basic structural problems were severe. Human Rights Watch reported that the total Soviet prison population had dropped from 1.6 million in 1985 to around 1 million by 1991. But pretrial centers were still badly overcrowded because of long detention, slow justice, and poor infrastructure. Detainees could remain in custody for 4 to 6 months on average, and many were held far longer. Tuberculosis was widespread in the penal system, staff shortages affected medical care, and even minor disciplinary violations could result in time in punishment cells. In other words, the late Soviet prison system was not only harsh, it was unstable. It forced large numbers of people into degrading conditions and then relied on old methods of control to keep order. That is what makes the prison riots of the late USSR so important. They were not isolated explosions in otherwise healthy institutions. They were warning signs from inside a damaged system. One of the clearest early cases to surface publicly came from Latvia. In August 1988, UPI reported that the Soviet press had finally given a glimpse of a prison riot that had taken place during the previous winter at a Latvian prison camp for youths. According to that report, 3 inmates died, and 5 were injured when soldiers and prison guards broke up the riot. Even that small window matters historically. A youth prison camp was supposed to represent correction and state control over difficult lives. Instead, it became the site of deadly confrontation between inmates and the institutions holding them. And the fact that the public only received a glimpse of the event tells you something about the information culture around it. Even under glasnost, the Soviet public was not being offered full, easy transparency about prison violence. The Latvian case is important for another reason. It shows that by the late 1980s, even institutions holding younger inmates were no longer insulated from the larger crisis of Soviet penal authority. If a prison camp for youths could reach the point where soldiers and guards were sent in and deaths followed, then the issue was larger than local discipline. It suggested a deeper erosion of legitimacy inside the prison system itself. By 1990, that erosion had become even more visible. UPI reported in June 1990 on separate prison uprisings in the Soviet Union, including one in Dnipropetrovsk in Soviet Ukraine and another in Moldavia. According to the report, at least 2 and perhaps as many as 5 prisoners were killed in the separate disturbances. The same UPI report said that in Dnipropetrovsk, more than 1,000 prisoners began their uprising on a Thursday night. That number alone tells you how serious the situation was. A disturbance involving more than 1,000 prisoners is not a routine disciplinary failure. It is evidence that order inside the prison had broken down on a large scale. A follow-up UPI report the next day described the Dnipropetrovsk prison as left in smoking ruins after stubborn rioters surrendered to riot police, ending the uprising. It said the revolt left at least 4 prisoners dead. A later summary in Prison Legal News repeated that the surrender ended a rebellion that had left the prison in ruins and 4 prisoners dead. Even without dwelling on the most graphic details, the picture is clear enough. This was not a brief scuffle inside one cell block. It was the destruction of the institution itself, as a functioning space of confinement. The Dnepropetrovsk case matters because it reveals the prison riot as a kind of political message, whether the authorities wanted to admit that or not. A prison is designed to symbolize control. When inmates take over enough of it to force a major security response and leave the place physically devastated, the riot stops being only an internal disciplinary event. It becomes a public statement about the limits of state power. In late Soviet conditions, that mattered even more because the wider country was already in turmoil. National tensions were rising, the economy was weakening, public trust was falling, and institutions that once looked permanent were beginning to crack. A prison riot in that setting looked less like an exception and more like a symptom. It is also important to look at why these uprisings happened. The Human Rights Watch report does not reduce unrest to one cause, but it is explicit that poor living conditions were a major factor and that violence against authorities was becoming more common in detention centers. The report describes detainees sitting for months in overcrowded cells, eating and using the toilet in the same confined space, with almost no activity and inadequate ventilation. It also describes work colonies where refusal to work could lead to punishment cell terms, where heating and medical care were recurring concerns, and where nonviolent and violent offenders were often mixed together. If you build a penal system around degradation, delay, and weak legitimacy, violence becomes easier to imagine from both sides of the bars. That does not mean every riot had the same motive. In some prisons, inmates may have been reacting to conditions, in others, to local power struggles, fear, or an immediate trigger. But the late Soviet pattern is still visible. The penal system was trying to maintain control with structures that had not meaningfully adapted to reform, rising legal pressure, or deteriorating material conditions. Even where staff abuse had reportedly declined compared with earlier decades, the institutions themselves remained deeply punitive, overcrowded, and fragile. That is exactly the kind of environment in which rumor, resistance, and collective violence can spread quickly. Another important part of the story is visibility. These prison riots became known to the public only partially and late. The 1988 Latvian case surfaced as a glimpse. The 1990 uprisings were reported in brief dispatches, not through broad public reckoning with prison conditions. That limited visibility matters because the Soviet and late Soviet state often treated prison violence not as a subject for public understanding, but as a problem of containment. If the public learned about prison unrest, it usually did so through fragments, a wire report, a partial newspaper account, a brief official statement. The broader context, overcrowding, poor health care, long detention, punishment cells, and the growing frequency of uprisings, was much easier to obscure than the riot itself. And that is why these prison riots matter beyond penal history. They reveal what happens when a state depends too heavily on force and too little on legitimacy. A prison can function for a long time through fear, routine, and isolation. But once those mechanisms weaken, the institution starts reflecting the larger crisis outside its walls. In the late USSR, prison riots showed that the system was not only containing instability, it was generating it. The same state that had built prisons to suppress disorder was now facing disorder from inside one of its most controlled environments. These cases also tell us something broader about Soviet justice. The public often saw courts, police, and prisons as separate stages: arrest, sentence, confinement. But in reality, they were linked. A sluggish justice system fed overcrowded detention centers. Harsh detention conditions fed unrest. Unrest then invited violent suppression, which deepened the system's legitimacy problem even further. By the time riots broke out, the crisis was rarely only about one prison. It reflected institutional damage that had been building for years. In the end, the deadliest prison riots of the late USSR were not just prison stories. They were late Soviet stories. They revealed a state under strain, institutions losing control, and a penal system that no longer inspired even the minimal obedience required to keep order behind locked walls. The prison was supposed to contain violence. Instead, in some of the most revealing moments of the late Soviet period, it became one of the places where violence showed the system's weakness most clearly. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.